Hey guys, have you ever watched a wrestling match and didn't know who to cheer for and who to boo? Has there ever been the cool heel that is supposed to be the bad guy, but really you liked him and wanted to cheer him? Well, I think that's happened to all of us. So that's what we're going to talk about this episode. We are going to talk about how the NWO DX and Stone Cold Steve Austin changed the way people look at heels and anti-heroes and all that kind of stuff, and it's affected us even up until today. So basically from the Attitude Era all the way to the Elite. So let's get into it. First, we've got to go back in time, okay? We got to go back to the early NWA territory days there in the 80s and start talking about those territories. Had territory days, stuff like that. Your faces. WWF at the time was doing a lot of merchandising with the cartoons, the toys, the lunch boxes, all that kind of stuff. T-shirts. The NWA product was way behind on this. And even back in the early territory days, the faces would, get the pictures, the little, not 8x10, but whatever the size is below that. They'd autograph them, set up tables. But where kayfabe was so real, the heels, of course, would not be out at a table selling merchandise because everybody hated them. Nobody would buy their merchandise. That's why I've heard Arn Anderson, Jeff Jarrett, some of those guys that were in the territory days for a while there, talk about sometimes when they got paid on the house show, the heels would actually make more money from the gate because they knew the baby faces could compensate a little more from their merch sales. So, they tried to even it out. But that was the thing, the heels didn't have t-shirts. They didn't have action figures sometimes. They didn't have all this stuff. It was very different for them. But then something happened. 1996. We've got Nitro has started, WCW. Eric Bischoff has taken over. You have, first off, you have the curtain call where you got the Click up in the WWF. You've got the final show where Hall and Nash were on there and they were getting ready to leave. And after the show was over, Hall, Nash, Triple H, Shawn Michaels all come out in the ring and hug each other, even though they just wrestled against each other 10 minutes before. People were, they were all upset because, kayfabe was definitely being exposed there. The curtain was being pulled back. Then we got that Nitro. Scott Hall shows up. Everybody's like, oh, is Razor in WCW? What's going on? Is the WWF invading? Are they joining forces? Whatever, everything was there. Then Kevin Nash comes. You got the Outsiders. Then you've got the NWO, Hulk Hogan. He has the greatest heel turn probably in the history of professional wrestling. The fans are booing him, but you got the NWO that starts. And what does that do? Well, a lot of people didn't like Hogan, and they booed him because they felt like they betrayed. But there were still a lot of people cheering for Nash and Hall because they were cool. They were the cool heel. And I've heard Eric Bischoff even talk in some interviews about how the baby faces in the locker room were upset because people weren't cheering them because they weren't cool. How were they going to get over with these guys who were wearing the black and white and just destruction and anti-establishment and taking over? And they're supposed to be the bad guys, but yet they're getting cheered. So this starts a weird turn of events. Because before this, when Hogan had come, he was battling against Ric Flair and the Horsemen. He was battling against Kevin Sullivan and his dungeon. And they were trying to reproduce what Vince had did and build up all these monsters to bring Hogan down. And now Hogan's the bad guy. So Kevin Sullivan and his dungeon of doom there, they, are maybe being good guys, maybe being face. The Four Horsemen become de facto baby faces after spending all their life being heels. So it was a very weird dynamic. And then you still had inner struggles of other faces and heels wrestling, and then you had the NWO. So it just really shook everything up. And the ratings were out the roof, though, because these cool heels were coming in, and it was just something else. So it was a very interesting time. The WWF at the time, they start to shift too, as we start to see the Attitude Era. You've got Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, that dynamic, where, Bret ends up turning heel. USA and Canada, you have Stone Cold, who is supposed to be a heel at the beginning, but then he cuts the Austin 316 promo. Then he becomes anti-establishment, him and Bret Hart and their match and the double heel face turn there. Like I said, Shawn and Bret, all that dynamic. Then DX is being over and cheered, and then they go against Stone Cold and bring in Mike Tyson, and he turns, and the Attitude Era has blown up, and the lines were blurred. Who do I cheer? Who's supposed to be the actual baby face? Who's supposed to be the good guy? Who is the bad guy? Who's the good guy? All these things would go back and forth. And sometimes it would just be depending upon who they were wrestling. One week they might get booed. One week they might be cheered. So it was very interesting during all this to see what was going on. And it sort of brought in that anti-hero. And this was with the NWO, especially with Stone Cold, Mr. McMahon, after the Montreal screw job, and with Bret, and he comes out and admits he's the CEO of the company, the owner, and he takes on that persona. He's the bad guy. And then, Stone Cold is the employee that doesn't want to, do what his boss says and is against his boss and that. And, sort of the same thing with the NWO, the establishment, the Turner and WCW, they were going to take over. So you had that anti-hero, that person that, yes, he might be doing things that aren't moral, but maybe the cause is good, or maybe he's feeling cheated, and it made, the normal wrestling fan, think, hey, I don't like my boss either. I don't like the establishment. I don't like the government. I don't like big corporations. So these bad guys were getting cheered, and it sort of caused a weird dynamic in wrestling. But even in culture, pop culture, we saw some things like that. Going back to, like I said, Guns N' Roses, rock and roll, heavy metal, punk rock. It's always been that anti-establishment. It's always been that music that your parents told you not to listen to. That in the days, and it would have the niche following. It would have that, only certain people listen to that kind of music. But then, again, during the 80s, when metal, the glam metal, the hair metal, all that started to blow up and became mainstream, it was like, oh God, and that's what I was saying about Guns N' Roses. They came along when hair metal was just wearing everybody out, and they were a little bit different. And, and here all my friends didn't want to hear who they were until they got on MTV, and then they became over. They were the heel, they were the bad guys. And then what happens? They get over, and then everybody's cheering for them. So I sort of look at it like that. And then as time has went on in culture, movies, comics, Deadpool, not a very nice guy, but he's the anti-hero. He's over. The recent Avengers movies, Loki, even though he tried to take over the world in the first one, by the end of it, everybody's cheering for Loki, Did he really do a face turn? Well, no, not really. So you got that. Batman's been always one that rode the edge. He had he's not going to kill, but, he's going to skirt the lines there, and he's always sort of the outsider. Even the Joker, who the quintessential bad guy, you got people cheering for him and rooting for the Joker in some of these movies and talking about that. So times have changed, and that's why even through the 2000s, 2010s. You think about how that affected professional wrestling. Think about the stars that you watch. One that I can remember when my boys were just starting getting into wrestling in the 2000s, they thought Edge was cool. But, here he was, the rated R superstar, and I'm having to cover their eyes when he's wanting to do the live sex show, but he was cool. And they wanted him to actually beat John Cena. They wanted him to do that, even though he was supposed to be the bad guy. So, I think that whole NWO incident, which led into the WWF and the DX, Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, Stone Cold, Attitude Era, that completely changed the basic fundamentals of the way wrestling had been formatted and programmed. Because before it was easy. You find a heel, you find a baby face, and good versus evil. But now you got those, tweeners, those guys who are in the middle, and it's like, how do we balance this? And I think it, even put more pressure on the locker room because, before the baby faces were just competing with the baby faces to get over. But now the baby face is competing with a heel who's getting cheered, so it made it very, very unique. And it looks like, as time has went on, we're not going to change from it any. That does it for another episode of Ted's Takes on Wrestling. Again, this is Ted, the Hillbilly Hill. Appreciate you watching this video. We'd really appreciate it if you would hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit that notification bell, and also let us know, did we leave something out from the Attitude Era that changed the way the heels, the cool heel, the anti-hero, did we leave somebody or some moment out that you would like to talk about? So just let me know in the comments. And until next time, always remember, there's the real truth, then there's the heel truth.